Welcome back, and in this video we're going to be covering while and do while loops. Now while loops are quite useful as they allow us to repeatedly execute a bit of code based on a Boolean condition value. So let's write one out. And it simply starts off as while, and then we'll have our Boolean condition, and then we simply just have a pair of curly braces with the code that we want repeated between them. So it's quite similar to an if statement. And we can start with something like while true, and we can give it a bit of code. So for example, I'm going to get it to print out hello Java. And so what this code will do is it will say while this condition is true, it will keep repeating this bit of code. And so we know true is always true, so this should technically keep repeating forever. And if we run that, we can see that's actually what happens. So I'm going to stop that by hitting this red button here. And so let's actually look at if we put in a condition that will terminate. So I'm going to start off by defining a number, and I'm going to say int num for number is equal to 0. And then I want to say I want this to iterate or repeat the piece of code whilst number is less than 10. Okay? And so what I have to do is I actually have to need to make sure I put my semicolon in. But I actually have to make sure that the value of num changes, because right now if num is 0, well 0 is always going to be less than 10. So I'm going to say num is then equal to the old value of num plus 1. And so if I run this, and feel free to follow along with me, we can see we get hello Java printed 10 times. However, this is one way to write it, and as coders we obviously want to be efficient. And so what we can actually just write is num plus plus, and that will have exactly the same effect and increment num by 1. So now what if I wanted to say, for example, increment it by 2? Then I'm going to introduce another concept which we can use, and that's the concept of having plus equal. And so what we do is we just simply put in the value we want to increase it by. And so this will be the same as what we had before, except it's increasing it by 2. Or we could put 3 and it would increase it by 3. So for example, if I wanted to put 5, then we would have it printing out twice, because 5 goes into 10 twice. And as you can see, that's exactly what happens. And a cool thing to note is that we can actually use this with any of the operators. So I could set minus, and then the value would decrease by 5 every time. Or we could actually use it with multiply, which is represented by star in programming, or divide, which is represented by slash. And so in this instance, for example, num would divide by 5 every time the loop iterates. So let's try that out with an example. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change this to print the values of num instead of hello Java. It's just so we can have a proper idea of how the numbers are working. And I'm going to stick it with its initial operator that I had before. And so let's just have a brief look. We're going to start off with our num is 0. And then while num is less than 10, well 0 is less than 10, it will execute this code. So it will print out num and then increase the value by 1. And so the value of num will become 1. 1 will be less than 10, and so it will repeat this code, and it will keep going through until num is no longer less than 10. So let's run this. And as we can see, we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 printed out. And then when it reaches 9, the value gets incremented, so the value gets printed out, and then it gets incremented to become 10. 10 is no longer less than 10 because it's equal to 10, and so it's not printed out. However, we can actually change this so that it's based on less than or equal to. And the way we do that is simply by just adding an equal sign after the less than sign. And so if we run this again, we should see that it gets printed up to 10. If we wanted to, we could also choose to compare multiple Boolean conditions. And this is where the concept of the and or operators come into play. So for example, here we have num is less than or equal to 10, and so our while condition will stop executing once this is false. But then we can also have it based on something else. And so what we can do is use the AND operator, and this will combine the two conditions and evaluate them into one whole thing. So for this, we need num less than or equal to 10 and true to be true. This could be some other Boolean condition. So for AND, what it means is that for this whole thing to evaluate to true, you would need both separate conditions to be true. So for example, if this was false, then this whole thing would always evaluate to false. However, if we wanted only one of the conditions to be true, then we could simply use the OR operator, which is essentially 2 lines, okay? And you can actually find that on your keyboard by pressing Shift and then the backslash sign. And so what this will do is evaluate both conditions, and so the whole thing will evaluate to true as long as one of them are true. So for example, if I change this to true, then this condition will always evaluate to true. And so this is really useful if we want our program to execute something based on multiple conditions. So I'm going to go ahead and define a Boolean value for us to use, and I'm going to put that in. So I'm going to define it as Boolean and terminate now. And that's going to be set to true. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to throw this in and throw in terminate now. This doesn't actually have to be a Boolean, this can also be another number condition as well. So it could be, for example, whilst num is greater than 6 as well. And so what we're going to do is if we run this, then we can see that this will execute up till 10 because this condition is true whilst num is less than or equal to 10, but then it becomes false, so the whole thing evaluates to false. However, if I change this to false and run it, then we can see that nothing gets printed because this is false, and so the whole thing evaluates to false. So now we're going to move on to 2 of the more advanced features of a while loop, and that includes the keywords break and continue. So both these words can actually be quite useful to our while loop, and we'll start off by looking at the break statement. So we use the break statement whenever we want our loop to terminate early, regardless of what this condition is. So for example, we could use an if statement, and these are perfectly valid inside your while loop, and we can say if num is equal to, say, 6 at any point, then we want to break our loop or terminate. Okay, and so if I run this, we can see that, we see that we get nothing because this is set to false. So I'm going to set this to true, and then now if we run it, we can see we get the numbers 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because it gets to 5, the number gets incremented, and so 5 plus 1 is 6, 6 is equal to 6, and so the whole thing breaks. So alternatively, we'll also have our continue statement. And so what this does is it simply skips to the next iteration of the loop, regardless if there's any code following it. And so let's try this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this code and put it here, change this to our continue keyword, and I'm going to increment the number beforehand. So we'll have num plus plus, and then if num's equal to 6, continue, and if not, then print it out. So what having the continue statement here does is essentially it means we'll skip the code afterwards, and so it should actually skip out printing number 6. So let's try this out. And so as you can see, I've run it, and we have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now the reason it goes to 11 is because it's incrementing the numbers beforehand and then printing it. So if we look here, that's why we can see that the number 0 actually hasn't been printed, because it goes 0 plus 1, so 0 plus 1 is 1, and then, 1's not equal to 6, so it'll skip that part and then simply print number 1. And so, like how we can use these Boolean conditions in the if statement, we can also similarly use 2 Boolean conditions in one if statement, and it will evaluate in the exact same way. And so that's an overview of while loops. And now we're going to move over to do while loops, which are actually very similar. And all they do is simply just evaluate the condition at the end of the loop. So the way I'll do this is simply by grabbing this, and I'm going to copy and paste it and put it at the end here. And then what I need to do here is I need to put a do. And so it will do this code, i.e. it will execute this code between these 2 curly braces while this condition is true. And so I'm going to throw in a semicolon. And so what that means is you're actually guaranteed to run your code once every single time. So if we see here, it's run in pretty much the same way. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to get a much clearer view of how this all works. So I'm going to get rid of this and just change it to a nice simple system.out.println, and I'm going to get it to print hello Java, and that's it. And I'm going to set this to false. So for a normal while condition, obviously this would just skip over and not execute this code. However, if we run this, and we can see it gets printed once because the program hits the do, prints this out, and then goes to the while, evaluates the condition, sees it's false, and so doesn't bother repeating it any more times. So that's a summary of while and do while loops. And I hope you've enjoyed the content in this video. And if you'd want to practice, I'd definitely recommend writing your own loops and maybe trying your own while loop to, say, print out a series of numbers. And I'll be putting all the code from this video in my Git repository, so feel free to check that out. And what I'll also do is put in a few examples looking at different things such as printing out the even numbers up to a certain point. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed my content, and please like, share and subscribe.